Three, two, one. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session on decarbonising aviation. Some of you will know that back in June, we ran a symposium on sustainable aviation fuels. The agenda has moved on much more quickly than we thought it would, thanks to the announcement by Airbus, and we'll come back to that with Keith shortly. But before we come to that part of this afternoon's agenda, I wanted to ask Noel Josephides, who's a tour operator with Sunville Holidays, well known in the travel and tourism industry, a tour operator with years of experience, to talk about why a form of decarbonised aviation is so important to the travel and tourism industry. So Noel, if you'd like to fill us in on the tour operator's perspective on this.
I think before I go into what's happened this year, we have to remember what was happening in 2019. In 2019, we were seeing the Sustainable Coalition for Aviation saying that emissions had gone up 32% in the previous 5 years. IATA was saying that emissions had gone up 5.2% in a single year. And we were seeing an enormous overcapacity in the market, in aviation. And I suppose that really began once Europe liberalized its airspace. And the result of that enormous growth was almost force-feeding the public with extremely low fares, which were unsustainable, and the airlines were beginning to suffer because there was just too much capacity out there. And it was beginning to create difficulties in destinations. We were beginning to realize that this had reached proportions that were beginning to impact on our businesses, on our ability to sell generally at proper margins. And we saw the arrival of Greta, we saw the Extinction Rebellion, and we were at a stage where, for the first time, certainly in the 50 years that I've been in this industry, that the message was beginning to come across that enough was enough and that something had to be done. And this was the background which existed really before we went into lockdown and March 2020. So we went from that enormous overcapacity, from airlines being tackled as to their emissions, airlines saying that they were flying the most efficient aircraft, but of course, even those aircraft were efficient. The fact is that if you are increasing capacity, that you were negating anything that you were doing. And so we went from that to a sudden stop. And in many ways, those who are involved thought, well, this is going to be a good experiment. The work's been done for us. Suddenly COVID came along, and the airline industry has been stopped in its tracks. Of course, that's not how it should be done. And the impact on the industry, on us, on the airlines, and the impact especially on the independent tour operator market has been enormous. All of us have lost millions of pounds over the last 9 months, and our ability to trade as we had been trading before is severely impacted. If you look and you speak to a lot of tour operators, most of them expect to be half their size in 2021. So we've now coming into recovery, or we hope what will be recovery, but it's fairly clear that this may not happen till the spring and the summer. And the exercise for most of the independent sector, and I must say also for no matter what size of company you are, is how long your cash will last. And if there isn't certainly an increase in the confidence in the traveling public, if deposits don't start coming in, if bookings don't start coming in, then we're still in a situation where the cash will run out before trade returns. So it's a very sensitive and difficult time.
No, thank you very much. I mean, it's clear that for the tourism industry in general, we need to find a way of making aviation seriously sustainable for the future. Aisha, if we come to you, and you're there in Jamaica, you're a climate change specialist, you're very aware of the difference that climate change is making to the Caribbean. But the Caribbean is really between a rock and a hard place, isn't it? Because you need in the Caribbean to be able to bring tourists to the islands. And for that, you're largely dependent on aviation or on cruise, both of which have serious climate impacts. How do you see it from a Jamaican perspective?
Certainly, you said that correctly in terms of the urgency and the seriousness of the need for us to address climate change in all its dimensions. My apologies, Right, the urgency and the seriousness of addressing climate change in all its dimensions. I think maybe you all by now are aware of the difficulties of maneuvering working from home with children in the home. So forgive me, I'm a little bit distracted and I have a little one walking around behind me, but I'm still very much present in the conversation. And hopefully you're hearing me clearly, Harold?
Yes, we are. Go ahead, Aisha.
Okay, great. Yes, so the point I was making is that you said that quite nicely in terms of summing it up, because the urgency for the Caribbean is not so much, as much as it still is an urgency to address decarbonization, the urgency is more so on the need to sustain livelihoods and the need to ensure that people's survivals and people's ability rather to meet their day-to-day needs are still in place. One of the things that is sure is that we cannot continue with the business as usual approach with the aviation industry. The challenge we will face as a region, being one of the regions that's most heavily dependent on tourism, is that we will have to measure our actions as it relates to cutting carbon emissions, addressing long-haul travel, and the implication of that for our industry. A lot of our tourists are now coming from, places far afield, North America, and much farther, including, parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, so to speak. And the implications of that are that reduction in long-haul travel, or the increase in the price and the cost of long-haul travel, is going to have impacts on the numbers that we get annually. And if I could just frame for you what our demand or reliance looks like. At present, on paper, it suggests that as much as 30% of Jamaica's GDP is derived from tourist-related or tourism-related activities. And that includes about 10%, which is direct, and 20%, which is indirect. Similar numbers for employment, with a population of, a little bit over 3 million, as much as maybe say about 500,000 persons that are employed directly and indirectly to the sector. And I don't think that accurately accounts for persons who depend on other downstream benefits of the tourism industry. And so, those realities are going to force us to make some very hard decisions, and those decisions cannot just simply be about what benefits the industry or what boxes we need to check, but again, what will it mean for people on the ground and people's lived experiences on a daily basis. Our first speaker, Mr. Noel, you spoke to the youth perspective and youth action, in calling for change as it relates to climate action and for bigger demands on the part of government. And I think similarly in the region, we're seeing that young people are very much involved in this initiative and this fight for a change in the way that we do things. I think that to me suggests that we have a cadre of, or a generation that is more likely rather, to take a different approach to even things such as tourism. So I think the future of aviation also depends on how these practices and behaviors change over time. And if we see a significant shift in people's behavior and appreciation for, these issues, so that you're willing to sacrifice certain luxuries, one of them being long haul travel and traveling to some of these more exotic places, then that is also a consideration that we have to bear in mind. So we may be planning for the industry without recognizing that there's some other undercurrents which are already going to determine the future of the industry. You also, Mr. Noel, spoke to the millions lost as a result of COVID, and we call COVID the dress rehearsal for climate change. The travel industry would have said time and time again that we can't do this, and the travel industry would die if this were to happen, that were to happen, and here we are in a matter of weeks in some instances. Everything stalled and they were forced to make these significant shifts. And I think in some cases, the actions that we have been calling for as practitioners and as advocates of climate change is for these very same stark and stringent cuts to have been made. And this is COVID and the world and everything saying to the industry, if you don't change, then your future hangs in the balance, in very much the same way you were unwilling to accept that at this point in time. But the people on the ground, again, it's not a question of the millions lost or the trading that they're unable to do. It's hunger, it's poverty worsening, it's their experiences on a day-to-day basis being severely shaped by these realities. And I think in some ways, to me, it's an indication of what will come if the decarbonization of the industry does not occur or align with the needs on the ground. And so as much as we are striving towards that, I'm saying long-term planning needs to include people's experiences and be shaped to ensure that the most poor, the most vulnerable are considered in planning and not just the bottom line.
Aisha, thank you very much for that. Keith, there's an awful lot riding on Airbus's success with this, I think. Do you want to talk about what Airbus's plans are and how you see the opportunity?
So thank you for inviting me to come and speak on this panel. Airbus has been committed to reducing its climate impacts for a long time. The latest aircraft that we have, which we're manufacturing, are 15 to 20% more fuel efficient than the ones that they replaced. There's a big program internally in all our industrial sites to reduce our climate impact. And as part of the UK Sustainable Aviation Coalition, we announced in February that we would become, as an industry, carbon neutral by 2050, in line with the UK's announcement for net zero carbon. And in September this year, we announced that we were seriously looking at, we were going to develop 3 new demonstrators, or looking to develop new demonstrators which were hydrogen powered. Hydrogen is a great opportunity for decarbonising the industry. It can be applied right away across all the platforms. So at the smallest commuter and short range level, we're looking at potentially hydrogen fuel cells. The short to medium range, direct hydrogen burn, and the long range, initially starting with sustainable aviation fuels, but moving on to power to liquid. I think it's important at this moment just to say that hydrogen isn't the individual answer, and that at this moment in time, sustainable aviation fuels are the immediate opportunity for us to begin to decarbonise. And as an industry, we're committed to reach that net zero target. The three demonstrators that we will be looking to get the right one, or looking at which technologies we will be using 2028, with an entry into service of in 2035. So I think it's a great opportunity for the industry to move forward, step change, moving away from kerosene, but a big step change for us as industry in our fight to decarbonise.
Keith, you just said that the plan was to have the thing as a demonstration by 2028 and flying commercially by 2035. Did I hear that correctly?
We're looking to develop demonstrators around 2028, with a commercial entry into service 2035. Yeah.
And do you think the orders will start to come through from the airlines to enable them to fly commercially from 2035?
Well, I think there's a lot of areas which are within our gift, and a lot of areas which are outside of our gift. So one of the biggest challenges that we have, or we see, is the development of the infrastructure for hydrogen. We need to see a mature hydrogen industry at an airport level. But alongside of that, obviously, there's a big challenge when it comes to airworthiness of a new aircraft. And I think hydrogen is a different type of fuel, but we need to do all the work up front to ensure the safety. Safety is paramount in our industry. So the most important part of all of this is the safety aspect. But when it comes to which way we will go, we announced 3 different demonstrators. One is a turbo prop, one's a turbo fan, and one's a blended wing body. And each one of them have got their opportunities. Each one potentially has. We're going to be examining each one. We'll be doing a lot of ground testing, a lot of testing when it comes to the emissions that we get from hydrogen. Hydrogen itself is a clean burning fuel and doesn't have the particulates. So there's also the opportunity to reduce not just the CO2 but the non-CO2, a much less NOx, and we won't have the particulate matter which contrails often form the ice crystals around. So there'll be a reduction in the radiative forcing. But there's a lot to research and to understand and to test. So we'll be looking at making decisions on which the program will be around that 2026 to 2028 timeframe.
And I assume that there's going to have to. I've seen from the concepts that there are pictures of that clearly there are some airframe changes, but I'm assuming also there'll need to be changes in the engines as well.
Well, yes. So, I mean, engine technology, we're working with a number of engine partners on engine technology. So this is very much a partnership. We certainly don't see that we have all the answers. We need to partner with airlines and airports, fuel manufacturers. So we need to see the whole industry moving towards hydrogen. But I think also it's important to say, I just want to make it clear that at this moment in time, the decarbonisation journey is we need to be focusing on sustainable aviation fuels as well, because they have a big part to play when it comes to the early decarbonisation of the industry. So when it comes to engine technology, that's still to be developed. I haven't got any nice answers for this in the moment. And certainly Airbus is working very closely with our engine manufacturers on how we will develop the engines of the future.
Thanks very much, Keith. I'm sure we're going to come back to you. Jason, Keith has raised the issue of the way in which the hydrogen actually gets into the aircraft. And you set up Universal Hydrogen relatively recently to look at that whole logistics side, and we'll come to Matthew in a minute to talk about what's actually going to happen in the airports. But clearly Keith is right. It's not just a matter of changing the way the plane works, is it? They've got to be refueled. Do you want to just share with us, if you would, Jason, from Universal Hydrogen, where your thinking is on this and what the plans are with Universal Hydrogen?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Harold, for putting together this panel. I couldn't agree more that this is such an important topic for us. Like Noel, Keith, and Ayesha said, we not only do we have an economic imperative to do this, it's also sort of it's a moral imperative and a social imperative to decarbonize aviation. There's so many benefits that air travel provides, whether it's through connecting people through tourism or allowing for global business to happen. That undoubtedly air travel will return and sort of have that same 15-year doubling time that we are accustomed to. And taking the time that we have now to think about how we power our industry is going to have major consequences on our ability to sustain growth over the next several decades. And so obviously, I think, you know, by the name of the company that I co-founded, right, you can tell where my head's at in terms of what I believe, or what we believe in universal hydrogen is the inevitable future fuel for most of aviation. Hydrogen aviation's been around since the 1950s, actually. So there have been planes flying around with people inside being powered by hydrogen since 1956, I believe, which includes several demonstrators, both with hydrogen used in direct combustion, but also in fuel cell electric powertrains. And I think, you know, the Airbus announcements a few months ago, I think just underscores that by and large, the technology is there for flying aircraft with hydrogen. And then if you take a look at the hydrogen supply side, with the increased mix of renewables hitting the grid, there's going to be a lot of interesting capacity for hydrogen generation as you look at off-peak energy supply, which is difficult to store. And so hydrogen is really being looked at as a good way to balance out that energy mix. And so we're going to be in a situation where we're going to have the ability to produce a lot of low-cost green hydrogen. We're going to have the technical ability to have planes flying with hydrogen. And one of the things that's really been holding the transition to hydrogen fuel for aviation, holding it back, is the lack of a mature, affordable, and ubiquitous distribution network for that fuel. Unlike the oil and gas industry, which has been around for several decades and spent, you know, somewhere in the order of $1 trillion building out pipelines and specialized tanker ships and trucks, hydrogen does not have the luxury of that incumbent infrastructure. And so what we've done with Universal Hydrogen is we created a modular way to ship hydrogen around the world while leveraging infrastructure that already exists. So in this particular case, we are using the intermodal freight network. So we've packaged up hydrogen in these pressure vessels, or sort of modular capsule type things. You can sort of think of it as an espresso pod, but for hydrogen. Those pack into ship containers, which we can then ship around the world on boats, trains, trucks. And then they get loaded onto aircraft at airports using existing cargo loading and unloading equipment, using very, very similar processes that containerized cargo is loaded onto aircraft. So this allows us to enable hydrogen fuel, hydrogen-powered planes without having to build trillions and trillions of dollars worth of pipelines or investing on a lot of new infrastructure. It also allows us to disconnect or sort of decouple the geography of where we produce the hydrogen or source the hydrogen from and the place that the hydrogen is consumed, which would allow airlines to expand the route maps and be a bit more flexible about the airports that they serve without having to make that decision and build out infrastructure and on-site production for every hub that they want to fly to. So we're pretty excited about the potential here. You know, part of what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make sure that as Airbus takes a look at and other OEMs takes a look at what their future program launches are going to look like, that we can prove out that there is a mature, scalable hydrogen distribution system that they can rely on as their customers increasingly shift their fuel source to hydrogen.
Thanks, Jason. I think it's pretty clear, Matthew, that brings us on really to the airport perspective on this. And from what Jason's saying, it doesn't sound as though there's going to have to be a massive investment in the airports to make this possible if the hydrogen arrives in pods in this way.
So I think that that's something we'll definitely need to understand further. It was great to hear that. Let me just, I'll say something on hydrogen at airports in a second, but let me just frame the overall challenge and pick up on some of what we've said. I think our collective vision here is to protect the benefits of aviation in a world without carbon. And we've heard from Noel and Aisha some of the benefits that flow to their companies and countries that aviation brings. And I think the last 6 months has really brought home to us what a world without aviation or without significant international travel looks like, which is poor on a number of fronts. So the collective challenge, protect those benefits in a world without carbon. The good news that we're seeing from announcements like Airbus and a growing coalition of players in the industry is that actually we can get to net zero by 2050. That's what the science tells us we need to do. And we've got to move rapidly on that this decade. Keith mentioned the UK aviation industry commitment to get to net zero through a mix of more fuel efficient aircraft, burning less fuel, switching to lower carbon fuels, and then looking at some of these new technologies. And we've published a detailed roadmap to get to that goal. And we're seeing a growing number of airlines around the world, aircraft and engine manufacturers, airports backing that goal. So the good news is we can do it, but there will be choices along the way. So the way we're framing decarbonising flight is that there are two main ways to do it. You can change the plane or you can change the fuel. Let me start with changing the fuel, actually. And this is really all about sustainable aviation fuels that Keith talked about. And the big advantage of these fuels is they are proven already. They are lower carbon. And critically, they can be dropped into existing aircraft, pipelines, and infrastructure. So as soon as we can start producing these fuels, we can start scaling them up and we can start decarbonising. What we need to do that, both in the UK and around the world, is the right government policy framework, because these fuels currently cost more than the alternative. So we've got to look at, on the supply side, mandates to stimulate production, on the demand side, the right kinds of incentives so airlines lower the cost of the fuel they're buying and we make it competitive. But the good news is there's a growing call both in the UK, Europe more broadly, for that kind of policy framework to be put in place. So that's changing the fuel. The other option is changing the plane. And that's really where something like hydrogen would come in, electric flight as well. You can't drop it into existing aircraft. You need to design a new aircraft, and you've got to allow the time to develop and introduce that. So we see that it's an important part of the solution. The challenge is it won't solve, from what we understand now, it will not solve the decarbonisation of long-haul travel. So the kind of hydrogen technologies that are being looked at, maybe for journeys up to around 2,000 kilometres. Now, those, we may be able to look at hydrogen for longer journeys by the time we get to the middle of the century, but from what we know now, we're going to need that sustainable drop-in fuel that can go into existing long-haul aircraft. Now, as I said, that's not to say hydrogen won't have an important role. Brilliant to see the Airbus announcement. And that does have an opportunity for shorter haul journeys. So the question for the airport then, back to your question, is what would hydrogen, indeed what might electric travel mean for the airport? And that's something we're just starting to look at now. So I don't come here today with an answer on this is exactly the kind of infrastructure we think we'll need. We're some way from understanding the kind of aircraft that might be flying and their requirements. What we are doing is just embarking on a significant piece of research to understand that. And what we'll be announcing shortly actually is some funding, working with other UK universities and UK companies to understand a short-haul electric and or hydrogen aviation system and what it means for the airport. And we clearly then need to look ahead to the mid-2030s and start thinking what kind of investments might be needed by us or by partners in the aviation value chain to deliver that. And that's why it was great to hear some of Jason's ideas. Are there other ways of delivering hydrogen that don't involve a completely new fueling infrastructure at the airport, for example? We need to understand all of that. I would say we're in the foothills of our kind of journey to understanding hydrogen, but absolutely on that journey.
Can I ask you a rather parochial UK question? How do you think this relates to the announcement made by our Prime Minister about, what did he call it, zero E aviation across the Atlantic, and the setting up of the Zero Jet Council? Is that going to make progress? Is that any way related to the hydrogen agenda?
Very much so. So if you look at that Jet Zero Council, it's something that the industry has been calling for, a joint partnership at a senior level between the right secretaries of state in government, the Prime Minister we know is very actively involved, the right leaders from industry. And it met for the first time in July. It's meeting again shortly, we think. 25 senior figures, industry, environmentalists, academics, as well as government, to get to that vision of flight across the Atlantic without carbon impacts. It's looking at two big things, really the two big things I described. How can you switch the fuel and scale up sustainable fuels and drop them into aircraft? And how can you look at alternative technologies like hydrogen or electric? So it will focus on both of those things. We have really high hopes for that group. It's brilliant to see the kind of political ambition we've seen from Boris Johnson in setting up that group and driving it forward. We now need to translate that to real action, and some of these things will need government support to help scale them up and get them moving. But we see huge potential there.
David, I will come to you in a second, I promise, but I just want to push Matt on one other issue. I mean, it's clear that there are problems about long-haul flight using hydrogen. That's absolutely clear. Everybody agrees about that. But Heathrow, the growth of Heathrow has partly been as a hub and spoke airport, hasn't it? So that one of the solutions to the problem of long haul would simply be to operate more planes hub and spoke. With the lack, okay, that would mean you couldn't fly direct to Australia from the UK, but you barely can anyway now. You'd have to fly on a number of flights, but you could still get there using hydrogen. That'd be good for airports.
So, is the question how might that affect Heathrow or airports that currently
presumably, if you go to a hub and spoke model with more passenger traffic of travellers through airports, that's quite good news for airports. The travellers might not think it's wonderful, but it'd be good for airports.
So I suppose, I mean, the way we've looked at it, hydrogen, as currently anticipated, serves routes of up to about 2,000 kilometres, and that's about 30% of aviation CO2 challenge. 70% of aviation CO2 is from journeys longer than that, not even long haul, actually, some of the middle haul and long haul journeys. So I think what the picture you're painting is one where people might potentially take a number of shorter journeys on hydrogen aircraft. I suppose that's an opportunity, an option for us as we look at decarbonisation. I think the aviation ecosystem has clearly evolved around short haul feeder flights, enabling those mid and long haul flights, which is why we're very focused on getting the carbon out of those flights. The good news is we think there is a way to do that. Sustainable fuels are proven. Some of them are flying today. They just cost a lot more. We need to rapidly scale them up. But with the right government policy support, we can do that in the UK and Europe, across the world. And we can make some real inroads in carbon from today, as well as developing brand new technologies like hydrogen from the next decade.
Thanks, Matthew. David, you've been very patient, and you're the man, or people like you are going to fly these things, hopefully. How do you see the future of aviation?
So firstly, thanks very much for inviting me today. I think it's worth saying that, even though companies like EasyJet will be operating these futuristic aircraft in 2035 or whenever, our participation in this whole thing is already begun and will be very important over the next few decades. We won't be sitting around waiting for the technology to arrive, then ordering the aircraft and off we go. So that's why last year, for example, in EasyJet, we began by offsetting the carbon from all our flights, simply because it's the only thing that we can do right now. And we know that passengers want to do something, and we think it's the right thing to do. But certainly it's an interim measure, and it's just the baby steps, if you like, on our journey towards decarbonisation. But as has been mentioned a few times by others, this is a journey of decarbonisation. It's not a big bang where we change all the aircraft overnight and job is done. So we're going to see various components of decarbonisation along the way, and a few of them have been mentioned already. So sustainable aviation fuel will be an important part of that, and particularly for the long haul operators, as it said, it's at the moment there are not a huge amount of other options available in that area. But there's also other things as advanced carbon offsetting, direct air carbon capture, improvements in the air traffic system. So we have a very inefficient air traffic system at the moment, and we know already that by modernising that system, we can save millions of tonnes of CO2 every year by doing that. improvements in the existing technologies. So Keith has already mentioned that aircraft today are some 15% more fuel efficient than they were just a few years ago. I began flying some 35 years ago in aircraft that were built in the 50s, and they were ridiculously inefficient. And just since the year 2000, so just in the last 20 years, we've reduced emissions by 33%, in EasyJet. So those sort of incremental changes will continue. But what's it going to be like in 2035 flying a hydrogen aircraft? I was asked this morning on another interview, and I think as a pilot, the laws of physics are not going to change in 2035. They haven't changed since the Wright brothers began flying. And so fundamentally, aeroplanes will still be aeroplanes. They will just be powered by a different energy source. I have absolutely no concerns whatsoever about the safety of future aircraft, be it hydrogen or anything else, because aviation is a highly regulated industry when it comes to safety, and it will have to pass very, very rigorous standards in terms of all of that. And I can also see that in order to de-risk that huge step change in technology, we might see aircraft that will look fairly conventional and will fly fairly conventional, but being powered by hydrogen or hydrogen fuel cells or whatever, in order to sort of ease into that technology change. I think it's unlikely that we will see the blended wing design as being the very first hydrogen-powered aircraft. I think most likely it would look fairly conventional, in the early days. But it's an extremely exciting journey for us. Where I have to say, personally, that the announcement by Airbus was the highlight of my 2020 so far. It really was a great moment to see the biggest aircraft manufacturer in the world putting a stake in the ground and say, we will develop a zero emissions aircraft. That was really something. We're very proud to be in partnership with them in terms of developing that aircraft, and we've already had the first workshop, the Zero E workshop with them. We have another one next month, and we will be offering our ideas on how this futuristic aircraft can integrate into a short-haul network. And the beauty about a short-haul network such as EasyJet's is that we will be an early adopter of this technology, because most of our flying is under that 2,000 kilometer range. So virtually the whole of our network will be open to this early technology. So I'll pause there in case there's anything else you want to ask me on that, Harold.
No, I wanted to come back, if I may, to Keith, because certainly in my world, Keith, there's an enormous amount of excitement about the game changer that this is. I mean, it's interesting that Jason points out there have been hydrogen flying aircraft, I think he said, since 1956. And to be honest, from the outside, the aviation industry looks as though it's dragged its feet for the last 20 years. It's known that climate change was going to require this change to be made. And it's not really until Airbus made the announcement that we began to see that there was a real possibility of taking away the polluting effects of aviation. In the meantime, of course, we've seen this massive campaign against flying, and it's not flying that's the problem. It's the dirty fuel. That's the issue. It's not flying that people object to. It's the fuel. And it's really exciting, Keith, to see Airbus actually take this on. And I suppose I could ask why it's taken so long for the aviation industry to adopt this, but that would perhaps be unkind. What I would like us to do, because I accept what you're saying, Matt, about sustainable aviation fuels, there are many of them. But the biofuels are going to end up competing with the production of food, and we know we're going to have problems about that. And we're not going to have problems about food.
No.
Okay, no. Really, pick it up now.
Really important misconception, and this is one of we're trying to, as an industry at the moment, trying to bust some of the myths about sustainable fuel. The first generation of biofuels, including some of those used in road transport, did compete with land for fuels, and indeed there's evidence of links to deforestation, for example. What we're talking about with fuels now is second generation, which are typically from waste. And in the UK, that will be a mix of municipal solid waste, so household waste. It could be agricultural or waste. It could be forestry waste. It might even be waste industrial gases. That's one of the other projects being looked at. But it's about converting waste into jet fuel. And critically, these fuels will need to meet very strict sustainability standards that certify that they do cut carbon, and that they do that they are produced sustainably as well. And don't get me wrong, I think I was hugely excited. It was brilliant to hear your excitement about the Airbus announcement, David. I had exactly the same reaction. You're brilliant to see that kind of ambition for zero emission flight. But I suppose what I'm really focused on, what we're focused on, is net zero 2050 is where we've all got to get to. The science says we've got to get there to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And by the way, it's not just about where we get in 30 years, we've got to halve emissions in the next decade. And if you look at that, I can absolutely see hydrogen playing a role. From 2035, aircraft will start to come in and they could solve short haul. But if we're serious about that 2050, we've got to start scaling up sustainable aviation fuel now, because I haven't seen any evidence yet that we've got another alternative to get to our 2050 goal. That's why I'm so focused on this.
Well, Matthew,
So I'd like to chime in there, actually. So one of the misconceptions I think about hydrogen is the timeline with which it's going to be viable, both from a sort of implementation perspective and also an economic perspective. So one of the things that we're trying to do to sort of help ease the way for some of the clean sheet aircraft to enter service in the mid 2030s, as Keith mentioned, is we're working on an aircraft conversion of a regional turboprop, which we believe we can get flying and fully certified and, under a supplemental type certificate by 2025. That will be a really nice proof point. It'll be about a 40-passenger aircraft flying up to about 1,000 kilometers. And we think that's a really good proof point. It's a reasonable size. Major airlines fly this type of aircraft. And also it'll provide a good impetus for us to scale up our hydrogen distribution network. That also happens to be around the time that the cost of hydrogen production is expected to fall quite dramatically, such that it is on par or better from a direct operating cost perspective than sort of conventional jet fuel. And so if you think about it, right, if I were to tell an airline, hey, we can completely eliminate your carbon emissions, we can do it at no operating cost penalty. And as a matter of fact, as time goes on, the operating costs get lower because there's less maintenance costs and the cost of hydrogen will continue to fall. That seems like a pretty good value proposition. And so that's sort of what we're working towards. I think we all agree that 2050 we need to be net zero, and I think we need to. I think you're right. The halving by 2030 is going to be the harder thing to do, and I think in order to get there, we're not only going to need to press on sustainable aviation fuels. I think we're also going to need to pull the timeline in on fuels like hydrogen, and that's what we're trying to do. But certainly, this is going to be something that we're going to have to work with a lot of partners to make happen.
Can I just also add, really on top of both of what the last speakers have said, is that the opportunity for long haul flight initially is sustainable fuels, but the long-term opportunity for long haul flight brings together the technology from hydrogen and brings together carbon capture and storage and produces power to liquid fuels, which have a hydrogen source, but they are a sustainable aviation fuel with a drop-in capability. So aircraft today are able to fly on those fuels now. The challenge, as Matt has already said, is policy, but also it's economics, and the cost of power to liquid fuels is 4 or 5 times what that is of conventional kerosene. So we do need to see policy changes. We need to see the cost of hydrogen come down. And that's going to happen when we see a much greater decarbonisation of the electricity generation. So as we see that happen, as we see an upscaling of electricity generation, whether it's solar or offshore wind or right across the spectrum, even small modular reactors that are being proposed, that as we see that green electricity being generated, the green hydrogen, which can then be used with carbon capture carbon to produce power to liquid fuel. So it brings the two technologies together.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to give the final word at the end to Noel and Aisha to see whether they've found any reassurance in what you've had to say. But I do think I should ask probably the big question. Several of you have mentioned the need for changes in government policy, and the framework has been in terms of incentives mainly, and possibly some increase in the mandated amount of sustainable aviation fuel that needs to be put into the aircraft at different airports, because presumably we're not getting an international regulation on this. But the thing, of course, which would make the really big difference would be if we started to tax aviation fuel. Now, I know that's deeply unpopular, but that would drive change, wouldn't it? Because it would reduce some of the cost advantage of running around on kerosene, a dirty fuel. Go on, somebody's going to tell me I'm completely wrong and off my head. Matthew, you do it first.
I think we could start off by reforming air passenger duty to make it relevant to how much CO2 you burn per passenger kilometre. I think that would be a great start for the governments to look at, because at the moment, the APD you pay for a very, very short flight with one person on that aircraft is going to be exactly the same as paying it on a 2,000 kilometre flight, which is full of aircraft, so with a much lower CO2 pax kilometre. So I think the first step should be reforming air passenger duty to take into account CO2 RPK.
So we'd make APD a tax on carbon consumption, and then hopefully hypothecate that money to go into research.
Exactly.
That's my fancy world. Matthew.
I also, there was a report recent.
Sorry, Keith, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there's a recent report, and I can't remember who published it, that actually said that a taxation on aircraft fuel would not drive decarbonisation. I can't remember who did it. It was I think it was Stanford University, but I'm not 100% on that. And certainly the structures that we have at the moment with the EU ETS, which will potentially be morphed into the UK ETS, as well as Corsia. As we see Corsia ramping up and the carbon price increasing, that will drive the opportunity to decarbonise, but it will also drive the investment required to see new innovation. So it's a win-win. I think sustainable fuels we'll see the development of sustainable fuels. We'll see harder to abate industries like ours be able to use these offsets, which are more expensive, but we'll see the decarbonisation of the industry because of the carbon price.
I was just going to briefly say, Keith, sorry, Harold, I think, yeah, we've got a basic challenge that sustainable aviation fuel costs more than kerosene. I suppose you could look at that two ways. What we're looking at is incentives that will help lower the price gap, lower the cost of sustainable fuel. What you're saying effectively is raise the price of kerosene a bit to make it more comparable. I suppose we look at it just really from a pragmatic perspective, which is taxation of fuel internationally has been agreed internationally, or not to tax aviation fuel has been agreed, and trying to unpick that would be a huge challenge politically, rightly or wrongly, and would take a lot of time. And doing it at a national level is a real challenge, because you get into the whole world of competitive distortion then. So our view is let's look at what is practical in terms of incentives that help lower the cost of SAF initially. But the goal ultimately is to make SAF commercial. I would just agree with the other speakers that there are a range of ways in which aviation pays its carbon costs, be it the UK's air passenger duty tax, European emissions trading, Corsia, and we absolutely support the principle of carbon pricing. Aviation pays it already, but we expect that to rise. We need to see that price signal to continue to drive change.
But we need to see quite a massive increase in the carbon price, don't we, for it to be in any way going to drive change?
Yes, and that is starting to happen already. And I would say price is part of it. I think if you look at scale up of SAF, I think carbon pricing will help. Supply side mandates for fuel production will help. There'll be a number of tools, but absolutely carbon price will be part of it. Jason,
I can sense you wanting to come in.
Well, I mean, I think that SAF is certainly going to probably be the long term, the medium to long term solution for wide body long haul flights. But I really do believe that hydrogen is economical in the fairly near term. Like I said, by the mid 2020s, we believe that in basically all jurisdictions in the world, hydrogen will be cost comparable to aviation fuel, aviation kerosene. And so I think we need to take a look at how aggressively we try to roll that system out, whether it's airports and airlines sort of stepping up and taking a little bit of a risk and trying to do something a little bit different, or OEMs continuing to partner with new companies to sort of see how they might work together to sort of really make this hydrogen infrastructure work. I think it's a lot less challenging than maybe people might have expected. Certainly, it's a lot if you had told me a year ago whether hydrogen aviation was going to be feasible within 5 or 10 years, I would have said probably not. But over the past year, I think there's been a lot of developments in the way that people are thinking about this new fuel source. And also, I think we've come up with a pretty novel way that allows us to scale the system in a way that I don't think people thought was possible even 9 months ago. So I think there's a lot of potential there that will allow us to, in the short term, or short to medium term anyway, mitigate some of the economic challenges that other alternative fuels may have, because I think hydrogen, by virtue of the decarbonization of the electrical grid and the excess power that's going to be available during off-peak hours, I think it actually does become a really interesting thing to look at that doesn't require too many other additional subsidies than are already in place.
If I might briefly add, we would share Jason's caution with imposing mandates on sustainable aviation fuel. It's a very broad brush method, which would, yes, might drive investment into SAF, but that investment may then detract from investments in zero emissions technology, and perhaps would favor the long haul operators that don't have any other option at this stage, whereas we would obviously want investment into short haul technology, zero emissions, hydrogen, and so on, and wouldn't want to be tied into complicated SAF mandate, which would push us against those investments.
We are rapidly running out of time, and I do want to allow Aisha and Noel to come back at the end of this. They've sat very patiently listening to the debate. I'd just like to emphasize what several of you have actually said, which is it's the next 10 years which makes a really big difference. It isn't a matter of what we achieve by 2050, it's what we achieve by 2030. And I think it would help if people stopped talking about getting to zero carbon by 2050 and started talking about a much more realistic target by 2030, because we need to remember that carbon's going to hang around in the atmosphere, warming up the environment for my kids, if I had any. And for yours as well. The damage is being done now. But Aisha, can I come to you first? Have you been reassured at all by anything you've heard here?
I've been reassured, and I've been made a little bit more anxious about what is put. I think as a Caribbean national, someone living in a region heavily dependent on tourism, as much as a practitioner, climate practitioner, and an advocate for this kind of action, I am mindful of the trade-offs that will have to take place. And like I started earlier by saying, the implications on some of the more vulnerable, economically vulnerable, will be great. I hear from the discussions, and I think Keith said a few times that newer technologies are more expensive. It has also been said that the newer technologies will more likely be used on short-haul flights initially. And so, bearing in mind that people's choices and patterns will shift in line with these changes, I'm concerned that we will see fewer persons, choosing to do long-haul travel, just wanting to say you're a good citizen, checking a box. I'm going to choose a shorter flight on which I will, that will emit less carbon. And so there are implications there for the region, for Jamaica. I think one of the things that's evident is that, and you've said it, in different ways, that the policies that we make at this level will be critical to determine how our countries adapt to these changes. I think a big part of it will be in how we equip our people to take up some of the new opportunities that will be created by this, restructuring. So what we call the just transitioning of the workforce, because inadvertently, low-skilled people are going to lose jobs. The people who are now doing the kind of refueling that is required on the tarmacs or wherever that takes place. So how do we then equip people to be able to tap into the opportunities that are going to be created? And how do we ensure that as much as the world is going to be benefiting from reduced emissions and reduced CO2 in the atmosphere, third world countries, developing countries, do not fall back in a situation where the benefits that accrue from there are solely for developed countries. And we do not fall back, and I say that as though we're out of it, but we're not, regressing in the gains that some of the developing countries would have made, being able to advance more economically. So I know it's ticklish, and I know there are some possibilities and some impossibilities, but I think the major concern that I have is, to what extent are we involving governments and people at the different levels of decision making in these discussions? Because what is clear for me sitting on this end is that if you're not within this circle of experts, there are a lot of things that are going to go over your head. And I think it's so important that people who are on the ground at the different destinations are now considering what are the short and long-term implications of these adjustments and making the necessary changes. So like I said, the countries do not slip back into more severe, situations of poverty, but are able to benefit as best as possible, and it's not just a case of the environment is doing better, but people are doing better. But I think when we talk about resilience and climate resilience, we must remember, the resilience of people and preparing people to tap into these opportunities so that environment does well, but people do well as well, and we all thrive.
Aisha, I think one of the things that's a challenge for younger people like you in the developing world is that a big part of the problem is ICAO's position, and that is a collection of member states of ICAO who make decisions, and in the end they will be major determinants of this. And one wonders if those developing countries are making the right decisions for exactly the reasons that you're describing. But that's a topic, I think, for another occasion. Noel, can we come back to you to give a tour operator's perspective on this? And if I could ask you also just to reflect on how important you think the cost of the flight is in terms of people's holiday choices. And I'm being told we've got about 4 minutes before I must wrap this up.
My main preoccupation isn't what's going to happen by 1935 and the fuels that are come, because I'm convinced that the technology and hydrogen is the way forward. I'm far more worried over what's going to happen in the next 10 years. You've already got Ryanair coming out today and saying that their flying in 2021 will be something like 75 to 80% of the summer 2021. You've already had Jet2 coming out to say that the environmental approach isn't their first priority at the moment. They're promising almost a low fares bonanza, and this all this does is fuel the wrong kind of tourism, and it places a great onus on the host governments. A lot of host governments have not liked the way that we as tour operators or as airlines have behaved. On the one hand, you hear that they're worried about the impact, about over-tourism, and on the other hand, already the Greeks have said, well, we want to incentivize airlines for next year. We will help in funding an increase in flying. So exactly where are we heading? The guidance should come from the top, and there are certain people at the top who understand the issues. There are other people who hold very powerful positions who will undermine that. And if the public gets used to thinking that for £15 you can fly halfway around the world, then what message does that really give about our industry? To put it bluntly, that aircraft shouldn't be flying. And when you hear the advertisements for millions of seats at next to nothing, you really wonder the whole philosophy of load factors. I mean, any tour operator, any airline can fill a plane if they're charging very low prices, but it shouldn't be happening. So unfortunately, I'm not very confident that over the next 10 years we're going to see much difference. Everyone is talking about, well, we will be back to 2019 levels by 2022. Well, that doesn't sit very well with any approach to improve the way we behave. And for me, that's the biggest worry. And the other factor, of course, is that if you speak to some of those host governments, they've already seen that their domestic market can, in many ways, replace the international market. They're traveling within their own countries, and this crisis has encouraged that. And I don't think that's going to go away in a hurry. So I think there's everything to play for. And I really do hope that the leaders understand this and just don't go down the path of capacity. And when one airline has bought another so many jets, there's someone else is buying even more frequencies. You almost feel sometimes that they've just got a pin and they stick it somewhere on the map and they fly there. And I don't believe that that's the right way to run business at all.
No, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm in danger of crashing the pips, so I need to pull this to a conclusion. What I would say finally is we will return to this. I think opening up a dialogue between the aviation industry, the people who deal with the logistics and the fuel, and the tourism industry is a really important thing to do, and WTM is in a position to do that. But could I thank you all for your participation today? I'm sure this is just beginning of a large number of conversations that need to happen. Thank you very much indeed, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.